So let me tell you a little bit about the origins of the Real Utopias project and what I hope to achieve under this umbrella idea. So the project began in the early 1990s, after the end of the Soviet Union. That was a very special historical moment, particularly for critics of capitalism, people on the left. At the time, there was almost a feeling that finally we would be liberated from the shackles of having to defend socialism against the model of the Soviet Union. But it turned out that the end of the Soviet Union also signaled the end for many people of a belief in any kind of alternative. Margaret Thatcher coined the expression, "there is no alternative," TINA, in the 1980s. And if anything, in the 1990s, that idea was strengthened. So the idea of real utopias, I coined the term, but the general idea of it is to try to reinvigorate thinking from critical perspectives about alternatives to existing structures of domination, inequality, privilege, and so on, to rekindle a sense of the possible in a world where possibilities seem increasingly limited. In 2001, a new initiative began in the world called the World Social Forum, and they organized their activities under the banner, "Another World is Possible." So we have there a contrast, Margaret Thatcher proclaiming there is no alternative, the World Social Forum proclaiming another world is possible. It's in that context that I then began writing the book, Envisioning Real Utopias, which is meant to bring together a wide range of ideas around these themes in a coherent way so that we can really begin systematically and seriously thinking about not only what alternatives are possible, but how to get from here to there. I'd like to talk a little bit about capitalism as an economic system and some of its dynamics, and particularly about its relationship to the environment. It's one of the themes that I pursue. This is located within a broader spectrum of problems. I identify four key values that are problematic in capitalism: equality, democracy, community, and sustainability. So this concerns the fourth of these values, sustainability. So what's the problem? Capitalism, after all, has been very successful in transforming the world, of producing masses of goods, prosperity for some, poverty for many, but nevertheless, it seems like a very effective growth machine. What's the problem? Well, there's a number of problems. The first is, I think pretty simply, if capitalism requires endless growth in order to remain stable and vibrant, and we live in a finite planet with finite resources, particularly in the current context where the use of energy is producing carbon emissions that create very serious challenges for the carrying capacity of the planet. Well, if capitalism requires endless growth and the planet cannot sustain endless growth, you clearly have, at some point, a contradiction, a problem of sustainability, of reproducibility. In the crisis of 2008, there were no politicians who said, "Thank God we are now in a period of stagnation. At last we can get our priorities right. We can stop having an economy which, in order to provide jobs for people, has to grow endlessly." Endless growth is simply not compatible with the reproduction of the physical environment in which we live. Now, why is endless growth necessary for capitalism? So maybe we could have a steady state capitalism, or even a capitalism that gradually increased the amount of free time people had and reduced the amount of consumption of the material world that we had. So what capitalism does is it has an engine for increasing productivity, but it biases the use of productivity towards the increase of consumption rather than the increase of free time. And this is very ironic in a way. I mean, if you ask people, what would you prefer? Would you prefer to double the amount of stuff you consume or have the amount of time you work? Most people would say, I'd rather work for the same standard of living as I have now and work half as much. Most people, when thinking into the future, would prefer more free time rather than more stuff. But if people actually were able to act on that principle, capitalist firms would find it difficult to sell their products. Competition would become intensified. Capitalism needs people to turn productivity into more consumption. That's why consumerism is not just a cultural phenomenon in capitalism, it's absolutely organic and central to the very core of the way capitalism works. But consumerism is neither compatible with the environment, nor, I would argue, compatible with the quality of life for most people. Most people prefer to have more control over their time, more ability to engage in social activities, in creative activities, not governed by the laws of the market and the imperatives of work in order to consume. And capitalism does not make that a possible future for most people. What I did was run what they call here a winter school, where a dozen or so students got together, and we spent 2 days talking about the problem of real utopias, how to think about it, what it means, sort of theoretical questions connected to it. And then yesterday afternoon, all of the students in the class presented short reports on some example of a real utopia that they found interesting. Now, the instructions I gave them were the following. I said, think of some example of an innovative institution that you have some familiarity with, and it needs to have the following character. It has to, in some way or other, embody values of equality, democracy, community, and sustainability in some mix, embody those values. It has to be something that can be created in the world in which we live. People are trying to build this now, but it points towards an alternative way of life into the future. It's kind of like, the famous Gandhi slogan, which actually Gandhi never said, be the social change you want to see in the world. He never actually said that, but people attribute it to him. This is sort of create the institutions you want to see in the world. Create them now, rather than wait for the future. Well, one of the reports was on the Northeast Street City Market in Brisbane, which I had never heard of. It's an example of what are generally called community gardens, but it is actually quite an extraordinary example. I've visited urban farms and community gardens around the world. I know a lot about them and about the different variations and forms they take. This is way out on the extreme of an ambitious, creative, activist form of an urban community garden that deeply embodies all of those values, not just some of them. It builds community, it stresses equality of participation and access. It's organized as a cooperative where the voices of all participants are heard, and it's committed to the project of sustainability. And it does so right here in Brisbane, in a floodplain which has land that's not usable for other purposes, that the council owns and which leases to the city farm. They have a communal garden that provides produce which they sell in their Sunday farmers market. It has allotments for individuals to grow things. It has schools and education programs to teach about permaculture. It has a nursery and seedlings. It has all sorts of ways in which people can both participate and use their experiences and knowledge from that cooperative farm to influence other communities and other centers outside of just the immediate participation. Community gardens always involve a kind of lifestyle project. People want to live a certain way. In some cases, it's more like just a sideline, a kind of hobby. It doesn't have an activist component. It's not trying to change the world. It's just trying to make the world a little more pleasant for the people who participate. That's fine. I mean, I don't object to neighborhood gardens that have that character, but the Northeast Street City Farm really goes way beyond that. It's part of a global process of trying to change the way people relate to their natural environment and the production of food, and seeing food as something that should be integrated into everyday life and the production of food, rather than done by distant farmers who then bring the food into urban areas. So I've been now in Australia, well, in Brisbane for 5 days. I've had fantastic discussions with students and faculty, some of whom I've known for a long time. A number of the faculty here at the University of Queensland spent time at the University of Wisconsin-Madison years ago, which is how I first became involved with the academic scene in Australia. My visit here is really part of a global effort on my part, where what I hope to do is have the agenda of studying real utopias and thinking about how they can be used to forge alternatives, how this can become part of an academic agenda, not just a practical agenda, how we can incorporate it into social research, in sociology in particular. The University of Queensland and Brisbane seem a wonderful place to have a node of this initiative take root, and I hope it does, and would welcome return visits to see how things go.